Hello, everyone. Welcome to a conversation with J.A. Jance. My name is Anne Hillerman. I'm also a mystery author, not quite as prolific as Miss Jance, but my eighth book, The Way of the Bear, will be out April 25th. These are the Jim Chi, Joe Leaphorn, Bernadette Manuelito mystery series. I'm going to introduce J.A. just very briefly, and then we'll get on to some questions I have. And then after I ask my questions, then I'm going to ask her some of the questions that you all have submitted. So again, thank you very much for being with us today. With more than 21 million copies of her books in print over a career spanning 4 decades, New York Times bestselling author J.A. Jance is the author of the Allie Reynolds series, with Collateral Damage, the book that we're going to be talking about today, as her most recent book. She also writes the J.P. Beaumont series, the Joanna Brady series, a series of Southwestern thrillers featuring the Walker family, a volume of poetry, and more. Born in South Dakota and brought up in Bisbee, Arizona, she lives in Seattle with her husband. So why don't we get started with a little bit of background about collateral damage. Can you set the stage for us? Can you tell us what's unfolding as the book opens?
We have, the book opens with a horrific murder in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the young woman who's the director of a domestic violence shelter is gunned down on the doorstep of the shelter on Halloween night. And then the book moves to Sedona, Arizona, where Allie Reynolds' husband B is on his way to a cybersecurity meeting in England. And the vehicle driven by his shuttle driver, Hal Holden, is forced off the highway. The initial assumption is that it was an accident, but when the authorities realized it was deliberate, this is now a vehicular assault and potentially a vehicular homicide. And since it's always the wife, always the spouse, obviously, Allie Reynolds is the person of interest in this investigation. Then we meet the killer. And the killer is a guy who has been in prison for 20 years. He's a disgraced cop who went to federal prison on money laundering, police corruption charges, whatever else. And he has spent the last 20 years sitting in prison, planning how to get even with the people who sent him up.
You know, I think it's so your book is so interesting because so often in mysteries, who the killer is kind of saved until the last. And with Collateral Damage, we know right away who the killer is. And so it's a real different kind of mystery. And I think this plot is very intriguing. I know it had me going from the first to the last. I hated to see it end, but I couldn't wait to find out how you're going to wrap it all up.
Well, the thing is, Anne, this book had me going too. I've been in 40 years of writing. I've written, this is my 64th published novel. And generally it takes about 6 months from getting the idea, writing the first draft, getting that to New York, going through the editing process, about 6 months. This book, you think practicing makes perfect. This book took me a whole year to write, from March of 21 till March of 22. And I thought, I'll never be able to finish this book. After I had written about a third of it, I handed it to my husband. He's a retired electronics engineer. He actually built that first brick phone from Motorola in 1968. They gave him a piece of balsa wood and said, put the radio inside this. So he's a very smart man. he's also a brave one. So I gave him the first third of the manuscript and I said, would you read this and tell me what you think? And he had it for sort of a long time. And then he gave it back and he said, I can't read this. It's a mess. So I reread it and he was absolutely right. Because the way I wrote it before, we didn't beat the killer. You remember that old Sunday school song, the wise man built his house upon a rock? Well, this house was built on sand. And so I had to go back, do a complete rewrite and bring the killer in early on so we all knew what we were up against. The other thing is because his victims are all over the map, they're in Arizona, Minnesota, California, and Oregon. So there are multiple jurisdictions involved. And the cop in Arizona is focused on Allie as the perpetrator. And Allie thinks, well, since I didn't do it, and since I don't think my husband is the target, we better look into this other guy. So she and her people are conducting their own investigation on the side, and they're using their pet AI, Frigg. Frigg was invented a number of books ago. I didn't think my then editor would like it. But when she read that first book with Frigg in it, Man Overboard, she said, oh, don't kill Frigg, keep her. So we still have Frigg. But Frigg was created by someone who wanted to use her as his partner, and he wanted to be a serial killer when he grew up, and he used Frigg as his sidekick. So the deep learning he gave her was all deep learning she shouldn't have had, how to hack into stuff, how to get all kinds of information you're not supposed to have. And in this book, Allie is making use of Frigg's ability to do all that, and she's using that to point the other jurisdictions in the right direction, but she can't reveal how she knows all that illegal information. The thing I think is most important in this book is these days, all we hear about cops, we hear about cops in the newspaper when one or some of them do something bad, then it's all over the press. The other time we hear about cops is when somebody kills them. But the vast majority of cops are out there doing their jobs day after day, trying to set the world right. And you will meet a whole village of law enforcement officers in this book who are all working toward the same end, unknowingly having Allie Reynolds pulling the puppet strings behind them.
Talk a little bit more about Allie, about how you came up with the idea for her and how she's kind of changed as your series has gone on.
Initially, I was writing 3 sets of books. J.P. Beaumont, I got tired of him. They had me start the next, they let me write something else so I wouldn't knock him off. And I wrote the first Walker family book. And then my editor said, well, come up with another character so you can alternate. And so I came up with Joanna Brady. But by the early 2000s, I was tired of all of those people. So my editor said, well, write something new. It can be a new character. It can be an old character. Set it wherever you like. Have it here by the 1st of January, and we'll publish it as an original paperback. Well, it was May. I can write a book between May and January. So I said, sure. They sent me a contract. I signed it. They sent me a check. I spent it. And then I had a problem because I had no idea who was going to be in this book. Now, in the old days when I had writer's block, I compulsively watched the news. Now the news is so bad, I can't do that anymore. Instead, I go out and get my steps. I have almost as many steps as I have books in print. I'm at 20 million 345 this morning, but I'm not to my 10 yet. I'll be at 350 before the day is out. But in those days, I was still watching the news. So we were in Tucson, and at noon, I went to the family room and I watched the noon news, and my favorite news broadcaster, Patty Weiss, was on the air. She was 53 at the time, but she had worked in Tucson television news since from the time she was a student at the University of Arizona. So I watched the noon news, and then when 5 o'clock rolled around, I still had writer's block. So I went back to watch the 5 o'clock news, and Patty Weiss was nowhere to be found. She wasn't on assignment. She wasn't on vacation. She was just gone. So over the weekend, the other news outlets in town reported that between the noon news and the 5 o'clock news, her brand new news director had come to Patty's desk, told her she was too old to be on TV, and escorted her from the building. Now, it's a bad idea to make a mystery writer mad. And by Monday of the following week, I was writing about someone named Allie Reynolds being yanked off her news anchor desk and coming back to her hometown, Sedona, Arizona, to sort of duct tape her life back together. And she's done so in a very interesting way. She didn't get over everything that had gone wrong in her life instantly. It took a while for her to make her way back up, but now she's the CFO of her husband's cybersecurity company, and they're high profile folks in Sedona, Arizona.
So talk a little, mentioning Sedona and what you were saying earlier about setting. Makes me want to ask you more questions about setting. It seems in the Allie Reynolds, well, in all of your books, setting is really crucial to who the characters are. They're really kind of people who are part of that place.
They're people of that. I'd like them to be people of that place. I was born in South Dakota. And actually, I started practicing fiction at a very early age. We were living on a farm in northeastern South Dakota. And one Saturday morning, our family was going into town for groceries. And my dad was driving, my mother was in the front seat, and I was in the back seat with my two older sisters. And we were still on the road leading out to the county road when I let out a blood-curdling scream. I must have been at least 3 years old at that time. And my dad slammed on the brakes, and there were no seatbelts, so we all slid under the front seat a ways. And my father turned around and said, "What in the world is the matter?" I said, "You forgot my lamp." But of course, my lamp was imaginary. Nobody else could see him. Well, my parents had good reason to have forgotten to bring him along. So I've been writing fiction since I was 3 years old. He left South Dakota just ahead of it, just on the front edge of what was called the storm of the century. It was a series of blizzards that started at the end of January and the 1st of February and just shut down the Midwest for literally months. Montana and Wyoming were especially hard hit. I don't remember that it was 28 degrees below zero the day we left the farm. I don't remember the 5 days we spent snowbound in Enid, Oklahoma. I'm sure my folks remembered that very clearly. But what I do remember was the day we moved into our new home on Yuma Trail in Bisbee, Arizona. I remember hanging on the fence, the uprights in the fence, looking up at the clear blue sky and feeling the sun all over my body. And that was the beginning of my love affair with Arizona. And I've never gotten over it. So setting is important to me. When I started writing the Beaumont books, they're set in Seattle, and Beau was a Seattle native, and I had lived there for less than 2 years at the time I started working on those. So I had to do a lot of research to make those work. When I started writing books with Arizona at the setting, it was a lot easier because I knew the landscape outside. I knew where the mountains were. I knew the distances. I knew the weather. And it was sort of like pressing the easy button because I could report on all those things in the background, like the stage set, while keeping my eye on what the characters were doing in the foreground.
And if you needed to do any extra research, there are a lot worse places to have to go than Sedona and Bisbee, I have to say.
Yes, there are. Actually, one of the things I have used over and over in writing my books is Marshall Trimble's Roadside History of Arizona, because it's laid out by routes. And if you're driving from Phoenix to Flagstaff or Tucson to Phoenix, you can find out what happened on the various roads going there. And reading about the Mormon battalion coming from Tucson to Phoenix and missing water holes the first 2 days and almost thirsting to death by the third day. Boy, by the time we were coming from Tucson, and by the time we got to Eloy, we had to stop and have a soda at Burger King.
How do you balance your time from doing research like you're talking about to actually the time where you're creating the story?
That's a really hard question. During the past 3 years, my husband has had health issues, so I've been his primary caregiver. I've also had to start doing all the driving in the family. I never used to do that. I actually, at 75, I had to learn to cook. That has been an interesting process. But so I've been doing that for 3 years, but I've also been locked up at home. So I get up, I make breakfast, I get my steps, and then I go to work in the afternoons.
And if you have to do research, does that is just included in your afternoon of work?
That's included. But part of my creativity goes into the books. And I finished one book and wrote 3 more during those 3 years of COVID. But I also write a weekly blog. When I was a student at the University of Arizona, Bisbee is only 100 miles from Tucson, but those days, long distance telephone calls cost money. And so every Tuesday morning, even though my mother still had 4 kids at home, she didn't have a microwave, she didn't have a dishwasher. She hung her clothes on the line. She washed on Monday, ironed on Tuesday. Every Tuesday morning, though, she would sit down and write me a letter and tell me what was going on at home. So every Friday morning, I post a blog at my website, jajance.com/blog. And it's a window on my world that week. Sometimes it'll talk about what's happening in my book world. Sometimes it'll be something that has to do with my family history. This morning's is all about my travails of trying to get to trouble in Tucson, the Left Coast Crime meeting in Tucson, because after messing up my car reservation 3 times, when I finally went to Sky Harbor to pick up my car, which they told me was a manager special, and I thought a manager special and probably a Range Rover. I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. I thought a manager special would be something a little more humble than that. So I got to the airport and they proudly led me out to a bright red, minute Tesla. And I said, look, I am a 78-year-old woman. I do not drive cars masquerading as computers. I need a car that has an engine, an accelerator, a brake pedal, and an ignition. And you've got to fix this. And finally they did. But I look, just my computer can drive me to distraction. Yesterday, my phone had everything else on it, but the phone, I couldn't call anybody. And I had to call my grandson in Seattle, text him and say, can you please come call grandma? I can answer my phone, I can't make calls. And then help me get my phone back on my phone. So no, driving a Tesla was not for me. And
it tickles me to hear you say this, because having read Collateral Damage, I would think you were like on the cutting edge of technology.
oh,
I want to ask you, getting back to Collateral Damage, if people say, there are always people who all of a sudden they discover after 64 books that you're writing, could they start with Collateral Damage and have a good experience without reading the whole rest of your series?
see, here is my secret weapon. When I write a new book in a series, it's like walking a tightrope, because I have to include enough backstory that new readers will know what's going on without boring my long-term readers to tears. But I don't want to put in so much backstory information that my new readers won't want to read the other books. And actually, when I wrote my first Beaumont hardback, my then editor said, well, you need to put in a lot more of the backstory. So people, I said, no, I don't. I want them to read the other books. And that's why all my books are still in print.
What a great idea. Well, I have some questions here for you that people submitted through the Barnes & Noble website. And why don't we have maybe 20 minutes left. Let's move on to a few of those. And this one is from Nadia Roberson. And the question is, what is your process like when starting or planning a new novel?
Well, I write murder mysteries. So I usually start with somebody dead, and then I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who did it and how come. I met outlining in Mrs. Watkins' 6th grade geography class at Greenway School in Bisbee, Arizona. I hated outlining then. Nothing that has happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind about outlining. If I knew everything that was going to happen in a book, why would I write it? I write for the same reason people read, because I want to find out what happens. And so that is the process. But I have to tell you that as far as technology is concerned, Bill is a former electronics engineer, a retired electronics engineer, but now he's my literary engineer. And he's the one who gave me Frigg. He said, you know, in our family room, they can't tell this from where I'm sitting, but I'm over 6 feet tall. I have very long thighs. So I have a lap, and I work in an easy chair in our family room with my laptop on my lap. Bill sits next to me in his easy chair. The arms are right together, so when our dachshunds want to move from one chair to the other, they don't fall through the crack. So he sits there watching television while I'm sitting in the other chair writing. And that's not a problem for me. I was raised in a family of 7 kids, and we all did our homework around the kitchen table while our mother, Evie, was making dinner. But you better be done with your homework before it's time to set table, by the way. So at one point, and so Bill watches TV and I work. And so one day he said, you know, AI is really kind of interesting. You should write a book with artificial intelligence in it. And I looked at him and I said, are you talking to me? I'm the liberal arts major in the family. But he started giving me articles, scientific articles on AI, and I read them. He maintains that I have a whirring blender in my head, and stuff comes into my head, however it comes into my head. And then when it leaks out through my fingers into the keyboard, it is fundamentally changed. So he gave me all of this stuff about AI. And what came out the other end was a character named Frigg. And Frigg has become really interesting. She's very smart, of course, but she has a lot of trouble with idiomatic English. And so when one day Stu Ramey said to her in exasperation, "What does that have to do with the price of peanuts?" she immediately started quoting peanut futures to him. Frigg is often the source of humor, but any technology skill I have is due to my literary engineer seated next to me.
I think having a good partner with complementary skills is really a wonderful asset for any writer. And also having, like you were saying earlier about Bill, having somebody who will actually is brave enough to tell you the truth when you're writing something that doesn't work. So
yeah, it is. One time I was writing Beaumont number 5. And I asked him to read it. And he said, "This is the Seattle Post-Intelligencer article on this subject. You need to put the characters back in." Well, it happened that he was going to Vancouver on business. So we loaded my Eagle computer. It wasn't a laptop. It was a dual floppy Eagle with a desktop with 128K of memory in it. We loaded that into the car and we drove in almost total silence from Seattle to Vancouver, BC. Had the bellman haul my computer into the desk. He went to do his job and I sat there. And suddenly I realized that Beau's partner, Big Al's feet hurt. And as soon as I connected with Big Al's feet, I was able to write. But I had to understand that I had left the characters out and was just reporting the action. So he's been a huge help all the way along. Now, this is in stark contrast. He's my second husband, the good one, as opposed to my first husband, the not so good one, who I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program at the University of Arizona in 1964 because, as the professor told me, I was a girl. Okay. I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to me. He passed the class with flying colors. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. Never had anything published, but that didn't keep him from telling me in 1968, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." So actually, he was a big help, and so was the professor, because you shouldn't make mystery writers mad. In my first Walker family book, Hour of the Hunter, the female protagonist is a lady who's a teacher on an Indian reservation, but she always wanted to be a writer. Her husband, who was allowed in a creative writing program that was closed to her, is dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. You just love it when that happens. Yeah. And boy, was I surprised when the U of A gave me an honorary doctorate of human letters.
They're trying to make up for something, I think. I have another question here for you. This is from a reader named Gina Ritchie, and she's asking when your love of reading began. Do you remember?
Well, the first book I read on my own was one we had in our library at home. It was Smokey the Crow, about two little kids who rescued an injured crow on their farm. But what really happened to me and what set me on the road to becoming a writer was the fact that the principal at Greenway School, Mr. Nadolsky, put me in Mrs. Spangler's class in second grade instead of Mrs. Barker's class, because in Mrs. Spangler's room, over under the windows, were shelves full of books. If you finished your work early, you could leave your desk, you could go to the shelves, choose a book, and bring it back to your desk to read. And it was among Mrs. Spangler's books that I encountered the Oz books by Frank Baum, not just The Wizard of Oz, but those other books as well. And I wasn't fascinated so much by the wizard as I was by the idea that a living, breathing person put those words on the page. And from second grade on, that's what I wanted to be, and that's what I wanted to do. A number of years ago, in the lead up to one of the Tucson Festival of Books, one of the local TV stations sent a crew out to interview me at our home. And the cameraman turned out to be Mrs. Spangler's grandson. And he had inherited all of her books. And it was so wonderful to be able to tell him what a huge impact his grandmother had on my life.
Oh, what a wonderful story. My goodness.
See, that's what happens. If you live long enough, things have time to come full circle.
I love those Oz books too, I have to say. And I loved the fact that they were so big. You know, there was a lot to read.
Well, the Oz books for our generation were the Harry Potter books of that next generation. Not, well, they sort of skipped one, but I think the Oz books had the same kind of impact on us as the Harry Potter books had on the kids who were reading them then. When my grandson was 5 at the time, and we were snowbirding in Arizona, but we were on the same cell phone plan, and phone calls inside minutes inside the plan didn't count. So you could talk to each other as much as you wanted. And so I read the Harry Potter books to him over the phone.
Oh.
Until he was old enough to read them himself. He's 17 now. He's the one who picked my phone last night.
Yeah. Good. Let me see if we can squeeze in another couple questions here. Okay. This person is asking, what do you love most about the world of mystery and suspense and darkness?
Well, what I love about writing mysteries is my pact with my readers is evil doesn't win. In literary fiction, evil wins out a lot of times. And in my books, the bad guy is going to get it one way or the other. It may be just a frying pan full of hot bacon grease, but that did the job at the time. But I meet people who say, oh, I don't read murder mysteries. And I think what they're telling me is they're too important to actually waste their time reading something just for fun. Mm-hmm. And I sold life insurance for 10 years. And if you can sell life insurance, you can sell books. So I usually sell them a book and autograph it for their friend who does like murder mysteries. And I'm getting of the books, and I'm wondering, well, why did I buy this book? Well, it's because you were rude. Thank you very much. How dare they say something like that to somebody who is writing murder mysteries? But mysteries give me the opportunity to write about things I really care about. The Walker books are set on the Tohono O'odham, where I was a K through 12 librarian for a number of years. And I've had the opportunity to weave the stories and legends of the desert people into the background of my books. And I've been able to bring life on the reservation to life for people in upstate New York who will never visit Arizona, will never visit a reservation. When I did a signing at the Tribal Museum for Queen of the Night, the fourth Walker book, and I had been writing those books for years, and I thought I was being careful with their traditions and so forth. But I wasn't sure how they felt. So we went to this event, and I was amazed to find that when we got there on this terribly cold, dusty March Saturday morning, that there were all kinds of cars from Wyoming and Montana and Illinois and Wisconsin, because they had seen the event posted on my website. So they drove 140 miles round trip to come see what it was all about. Excuse me. So the medicine man introduced me, and it did the invocation. And I know he was talking about me because every once in a while he would say the word library. Evidently, there is no word for library in Tohono O'odham. But then some young people came out to do a circle dance. And the MC said, please do not take any photos during the circle dance. But when the dance is over, you're welcome to, and it becomes a social dance, you're welcome to come down and join the circle. Well, my husband, after we had a baby, he once went to the wine festival and sat in the circle and drank the wine. I didn't go because somebody had to stay home with a baby. But he, until the day he died, he rubbed my nose in the fact that he got to sit in the circle and I didn't. So I was watching that circle dance and I thought, you know, Judy, you've been griping about this for 40 years. It's time to put your money where your mouth is. So when they opened it up for social dancing, I went down and joined the circle. And when I stood up to join the circle, the people there gave me a standing ovation. And I joined the circle with my heart just overflowing with joy. And I thought, nothing can ever get any better than this. And then it did, because all those Milgon ladies, those Anglo ladies from Wisconsin and Illinois and Montana and Wyoming, they all came down and joined in the circle too. And that, just telling you that just gave me goosebumps, because as far as I'm concerned, that moment is the high point of my writing career.
What a lovely story. Gosh. I think going back to a little bit to why people were, the question about why we write mysteries. I think one reason we write them is the same reason people love them, that you like to see loose ends wrapped up. You like to see the bad guys get their just desserts. And so often that is not what happens in real life.
Actually,
And it's
in one of the hallmarks of Tohono O'odham stories is that a story must end where it begins. And Collateral Damage ends back in St. Paul. And when you get to that last scene, if the reader doesn't have goosebumps, I'll be surprised, because I have goosebumps just thinking about that scene, and I hope they have goosebumps too.
I had goosebumps. I think that scene is really one of the best things you've ever written. And I hope everyone listening to this will go right out and buy this book. It's really fabulous. So let me ask you one last question. And this is from another one of the Barnes and Noble readers. And they're asking, what was the hardest scene to write in Collateral Damage and why? And this is from a reader named Abina Miles. So she's asking what was of all everything in that book, what was the most challenging for you?
Well, the most challenging was writing that whole first bad third of the book. It wasn't a particular scene. It was that mishmash of a book. And one of the things my literary engineer suggested was that I wear date every chapter so that the reader would know where they were, what time it was, what day it was, to make it easier to follow. And that really did help it. But once I got on track with doing that, then the scenes flowed together. There wasn't one particular scene that was especially difficult.
Several of your fans are asking what you're working on now and what the next book will be. Can you talk about that?
I'm oh so happy to talk about that book, because the whole time I was struggling with Collateral Damage, I was thinking, boy, I've really lost my mojo. This is probably my last book. I'll never be able to write another book. And then, shortly after I started writing Collateral Damage, someone called me and told me about a friend of hers, a Native American guy, a Sioux, who in the 1990s was a victim of the boxcar killer. The boxcar killer was a guy who did hate crimes before hate crimes were a thing. And so he went around the country pushing, and he hated Indians. So he would push Native Americans under moving trains. Ooh. So this guy named James was working in Oregon in the rail yard. The boxcar killer pushed him under the train, and he was dragged for 1.5 miles before the engineer could stop the train. The cops came, they pronounced him dead, they zipped him into a body bag, they shipped him to the morgue in the basement of the community hospital. But it was a small enough town that one of the nurses working in the hospital knew who the guy was and that he was of Sioux extraction. So after she got off shift, she went down to wash his hair, a long-standing Sioux tradition. And when she unzipped the body bag, his arm came out. He went directly from the morgue to the OR for the first of countless surgeries. He lost the use of his right hand. He had to learn to write and use his left hand. He came away a paraplegic. He had to relearn how to speak. He had to relearn how to read and write. And my friend in Oregon, Loretta, who volunteered at that hospital, when he was in the hospital for months at a time, she would go to his room and read to him. And because she loved my books, she read my books to him. And because she especially loved Howard the Hunter, she read that to him. He spent the next 20 years working, counseling disaffected Indigenous urban youth in the Portland area and trying to get them back on the right path. But just before he died in 2021, Loretta spoke to him and he said, tell your friend to write more Indian books, more Walker books. There aren't enough Indian heroes. When he died, he didn't go back to the reservation in a casket. He went wrapped in a buffalo robe. And so while I was writing Collateral Damage, that story was sitting in the back of my head. One of my mother's other rules about dinner was you have to eat a little bit of everything on your plate, and no dessert until your plate is clean. And so I've applied that idea to my writing life by the fact that I'm not allowed to think about the next book until I clean my plate of this one. So I finished Collateral Damage, got the editing done, was ready to turn my face toward this book. And I wrote it in 2 months flat, beginning to end. It's called Blessing of the Lost Girls. It's Walker Family #6, and it's due out in September.
Oh, I can't wait. And the timing is good. That gives people plenty of time to read Collateral Damage. Maybe they can even read The Way of the Bear. I mean, one thing is, I think we've probably used up our time. I appreciate so much this opportunity to be with you. You are one of my heroes, I have to say. I love your books, and I hope everyone listening is going to go out and not only buy one for them, but buy one for their best friend. So thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, J.A., for this wonderful time.
And thank you for hearing this, Anne.
Thank you. You all enjoy the rest of your Friday. Bye-bye.
Bye.